Imagine, for a moment, the absolute terrifying pinnacle of modern corporate power. Imagine if a company like Amazon or Apple, unsatisfied with merely dominating global retail and technology, suddenly decided that normal business practices were no longer sufficient for their quarterly growth targets. Imagine if this corporation used its massive cash reserves to purchase a fleet of nuclear submarines, hired a private mercenary army of 260,000 heavily armed soldiers, and violently invaded a sovereign nation of 200 million people. Imagine if this corporation then installed its own CEO as the absolute dictator of this conquered nation, wrote its own laws, minted its own currency, and forced the subjugated population to work in fields and factories, completely unchecked by any international law or human rights organization, all for the singular, ruthless purpose of paying out massive annual dividends to a small group of wealthy shareholders sitting in a boardroom in London. This sounds like the plot of a dystopian science fiction novel, a hyperbolic warning about the dangers of unchecked capitalism. But this is not fiction. This exact scenario has already happened. For over 200 years, a single, profit-driven corporation executed the most aggressive, violent, and successful hostile takeover in human history. In a small, nondescript office in London, exactly 5 windows wide, sat a board of directors who literally owned the Indian subcontinent. This is the story of the British East India Company, the original, terrifying megacorporation. When we are taught the history of the British Empire in school, we are presented with a generalized, sanitized narrative. We are told that the British conquered India, establishing the crown jewel of their global empire. This is a fundamental, foundational lie. The British government, the Crown, and the British military did not conquer India. India was conquered by a private, publicly traded joint stock company. It was an imperial expansion driven not by the geopolitical strategy of a nation-state, but by the relentless, psychopathic pursuit of shareholder value. The story of the East India Company is not just a history of colonialism. It is the ultimate autopsy of what happens when the mechanisms of monopoly capitalism are completely divorced from moral restraint and backed by artillery. It is the story of how a corporation invented modern lobbying, executed the world's first massive corporate bailout, engineered global drug cartels to balance their spreadsheets, and demonstrated the apocalyptic consequences of valuing the profit margin over human life. The origins of this corporate leviathan were surprisingly humble and desperate. On New Year's Eve in the year 1600, Queen Elizabeth I signed a royal charter granting a monopoly on all English trade in the East Indies to a newly formed group of London merchants. The company was born out of a desire to break the iron grip that the Dutch and the Portuguese held on the incredibly lucrative global spice trade. When the first ships of the East India Company arrived on the shores of India, they were not conquerors, they were beggars. They arrived at the court of the mighty Mughal Empire, a massively powerful, immensely wealthy Islamic dynasty that ruled over almost the entire subcontinent. The Mughal emperor, Jahangir, viewed these pale, unwashed English merchants as insignificant, amusing barbarians. The entire gross domestic product of England at the time was a microscopic fraction of the wealth generated by a single Indian province like Bengal. The English merchants had to beg, plead, and offer lavish gifts just to be granted permission to build a few small trading posts, known as factories, along the coast. For the first 150 years of its existence, the East India Company functioned relatively normally, engaging in traditional, albeit highly profitable, mercantilism. They bought pepper, clothes, silk, and increasingly cotton textiles and tea, paying for these goods with physical silver shipped from Europe. But as the decades passed, a fundamental shift occurred in the psychological architecture of the company. The directors in London realized that trading silver for goods was a terribly inefficient business model. The profit margins were good, but they were limited by the amount of silver they could physically acquire. A far more profitable strategy began to crystallize in the minds of the corporate executives. Why trade for goods when you can simply conquer the land, force the locals to produce the goods for free, and simultaneously tax them for the privilege of living on the land you just stole? All they needed was a military pretext and a man ruthless enough to execute the plan. Enceladus. They found both in the chaotic collapse of the Mughal Empire and the rise of a young, profoundly ambitious, and deeply sociopathic corporate clerk named Robert Clive. Robert Clive, who would later be known as Clive of India, is the ultimate archetype of the corporate mercenary. He originally arrived in India as a low-level accountant, a teenager tasked with endlessly copying ledgers in a sweltering coastal office. He was notoriously unstable, deeply depressed, and prone to violent outbursts. But when war broke out between the British East India Company and their corporate rivals, the French East India Company, Clive discovered his true, terrifying calling. He abandoned his ledger books, picked up a musket, and proved to be an absolute military genius. He was utterly devoid of the traditional aristocratic rules of warfare. He fought with the singular, cutthroat pragmatism of a hostile corporate raider. The turning point of world history and the moment the corporation truly became an empire occurred in 1757 at the Battle of Plassey.
The Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dawla, had grown tired of the East India Company's arrogance and illegal fortifications, and he marched an army of 50,000 men to crush them. Robert Clive commanded a force of only 3,000 men, the vast majority of whom were Indian mercenaries hired by the company. Mathematically, it should have been a massacre. But Clive did not win the Battle of Plassey through military tactics. He won it through corporate bribery.
Using the massive cash reserves of the East India Company, Clive secretly approached Mir Jafar, the commander of the Nawab's army, and offered him a simple, staggering deal. Clive promised to make Mir Jafar the new Nawab of Bengal if he simply refused to fight. When the battle commenced, the vast majority of the Bengali army stood completely still, watching as Clive's small force routed the loyalists. It was not a military victory, it was a corporate coup d'etat, executed via bribery. The immediate aftermath of the Battle of Plassey was a scene of unbridled, horrific corporate looting that permanently altered the global economy. Clive marched into the treasury of Bengal, one of the wealthiest provinces on the planet, and simply emptied it. He loaded a fleet of 100 boats with pure gold, silver, and jewels, and sent it down the river to the company's headquarters in Calcutta. Clive personally took a cut so massive that this former junior clerk became overnight the richest self-made man in all of Europe. The East India Company had conquered Bengal, a territory larger and more populous than Great Britain itself. But the true, systemic horror of the East India Company was codified 8 years later, in 1765, when they forced the weakened Mughal emperor to sign a document known as the Diwani. The Diwani was a legal decree that granted the East India Company the absolute right to collect all tax revenues in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. This was the moment the corporation mutated into a monster. A private, profit-driven company was now the official tax collector for over 20 million people. The Enceladus. The companies stopped trading entirely. They no longer needed to bring silver from London. They simply used their private army to ruthlessly extract taxes from the Indian peasantry, used that exact same tax money to buy the Indian textiles and spices, and shipped those goods back to London to sell for 100% pure profit. The entire economic output of a massive nation was violently diverted into the dividend payments of a private corporation. To enforce this massive wealth extraction, the East India Company embarked on a program of militarization that defies modern comprehension. They used the stolen tax revenues to massively expand their private army, hiring local Indian soldiers known as sepoys. Because the company paid better and more consistently than the fragmented local princes, they easily recruited hundreds of thousands of men. By the early 19th century, the private army of the East India Company numbered over 260,000 heavily armed men. To put that terrifying number into perspective, the official military of the British government at the time was roughly half that size. The East India Company possessed the largest, most advanced, and most ruthless standing army on the face of the earth, and it was entirely controlled by a board of directors whose only legal fiduciary duty was to maximize the quarterly returns of their shareholders. To truly understand the chilling, detached nature of this corporate conquest, one must look at the physical architecture of the company back in London. The epicenter of this global empire was not a sprawling military fortress. It was a rather unimposing building known as East India House, located on Leadenhall Street in the heart of London's financial district. Inside this building sat the Court of Directors, a group of 24 wealthy merchants, bankers, and aristocrats who ran the entire operation. These men rarely, if ever, set foot in India. They did not personally witness the blood soaked into the soil of Bengal or hear the cries of the starving peasants during the famine. They managed the conquest of a subcontinent entirely through the abstract, sterile medium of accounting ledgers, stock certificates, and neatly written corporate memos. In the vast, silent filing rooms of East India House, an army of clerks meticulously recorded the tons of stolen gold, the thousands of chests of opium, and the massive tax revenues as pure numbers on a balance sheet. This bureaucratic detachment is the terrifying hallmark of the modern corporation. It allows for the execution of horrific violence by breaking it down into small, administrative tasks. The clerk copying the ledger doesn't feel responsible for the starvation. The director demanding a higher dividend doesn't feel responsible for the tax collector's brutality. The shareholder collecting the check simply feels wealthy. The corporate structure acts as a psychological firewall, shielding the beneficiaries from the moral weight of their profits. But occasionally, the sheer scale of the corruption grew so massive that it breached this firewall and horrified the British public. This occurred most spectacularly during the impeachment trial of Warren Hastings, the first official Governor-General of India. Hastings was the man tasked with organizing and expanding the company's rule after Clive's initial looting. Under his administration, the company engaged in extortion, forced treaties, and the systematic plundering of local Indian nobility to keep the company solvent. When Hastings finally returned to England in 1785, he expected a hero's welcome. Instead, he was met by Edmund Burke, one of the greatest political philosophers and orators in British history. Burke had spent years meticulously studying the company's ledgers and the reports of atrocities, and he was absolutely appalled by the psychopathic greed of the corporation. Burke spearheaded a brutal 7-year-long impeachment trial in the House of Lords, desperately trying to hold Hastings, and by extension, the entire East India Company, accountable for crimes against humanity. Burke's speeches during the trial are some of the most searing indictments of unchecked corporate power ever recorded. He explicitly argued that a private corporation should not be allowed to act as a sovereign state. He detailed how the company's executives operated with a geographical morality, believing that the ethical laws of Europe simply dissolved once a ship crossed the equator, allowing them to act like absolute tyrants in Asia while pretending to be civilized gentlemen in London. He exposed the system where local Indian princes were essentially run like mafia extortion rackets, forced to pay massive protection fees to the company or face annihilation by the sepoy army. But despite Burke's brilliant, impassioned prosecution, and despite the mountain of undeniable evidence proving the rampant corruption and looting, Warren Hastings was ultimately acquitted. The system protected its own. The British establishment, the House of Lords, and the political elite were simply too deeply invested in East India Company stock to convict the man who had kept the dividends flowing. The acquittal of Warren Hastings sent a chilling, unmistakable message to the world. When a corporation is profitable enough, and when its shareholders include the political ruling class, it is completely immune to the laws of morality and justice. If you are beginning to see how the historical roots of monopoly capitalism rely entirely on the absolute, violent exploitation of the vulnerable to enrich the elite, take a moment to leave a like on this video and share your thoughts in the comments below. It genuinely helps expose these complex historical operations that continue to shape the modern world. The catastrophic consequences of applying the ruthless logic of the profit margin to the administration of a nation became horrifyingly apparent in 1770 during the Great Bengal Famine. Famines had occurred in India before, usually due to failed monsoon rains, but the social structure of the Mughal Empire had mechanisms to deal with them. The emperors would lower taxes, open state granaries, and provide relief to the starving peasantry. The East India Company had no such mechanisms because providing relief costs money, and spending money lowers the quarterly dividend. When a severe drought struck Bengal in 1769, the crops failed. The population began to starve. But the East India Company had spent the previous years forcing the farmers to stop growing rice and instead grow cash crops like indigo and opium, which were highly profitable in Europe and China. There were no rice reserves left. As the starvation reached apocalyptic levels, the corporate executives in Calcutta faced a financial crisis. Dead peasants cannot pay taxes. If tax revenues fell, the stock price of the company in London would crash. Therefore, the executives made a decision of pure, unadulterated sociopathy. Instead of lowering taxes to grant the starving population relief, the East India Company violently increased taxes by 10%. They ordered their private army of sepoys to march into the starving villages and forcefully extract the last remaining bags of grain from the dying farmers. They strictly forbade their employees from hoarding grain, not to feed the public, but to ensure the company maintained a strict monopoly on the remaining food supply, allowing them to sell it at astronomically inflated prices. The results were apocalyptic. Over 10 million people, one-third of the entire population of Bengal, starved to death in a matter of months. The streets of Calcutta were choked with corpses, the rivers were clogged with bodies, and the feral dogs grew fat on the dead. And when the financial reports for 1770 were finally compiled and sent back to London, the corporate executives proudly noted that despite the loss of one-third of their tax base, total tax revenues had actually increased, and the shareholder dividend was secure. 10 million human beings were sacrificed on the altar of the quarterly earnings report. But the sheer psychopathic greed of the East India Company eventually created a massive financial paradox. By looting Bengal so thoroughly and starving its workforce to death, the company actually destroyed the very economy it was trying to exploit. By 1772, despite all the looting, the East India Company was facing bankruptcy. They had spent too much money maintaining their massive private army and fighting endless expansionist wars. The stock price crashed. The executives realized that if the company collapsed, the British economy, which was now deeply intertwined with the company's wealth, would collapse with it. And so, the East India Company invented a mechanism that remains a cornerstone of elite financial capitalism today, the too-big-to-fail corporate bailout. The executives of the company went to the British Parliament to demand a massive injection of taxpayer funds to save them from their own greed. But they didn't just ask nicely, they owned the government. At the time, nearly a quarter of all members of Parliament were shareholders in the East India Company. The corporation had essentially bought the legislative branch of the British government. The politicians were literally voting on whether to use public taxpayer money to bail out their own private investment portfolios. Predictably, the government capitulated. They granted the company a massive loan to keep it afloat. But the government also needed a way to help the company increase its revenue and clear out its massive backlog of unsold goods, particularly tea. To do this, the British government passed the Tea Act of 1773, which granted the East India Company a massive tax break and a total monopoly on selling tea to the American colonies. The British government essentially forced the American colonists to buy their tea exclusively from a corrupt, bailed-out megacorporation just to prop up its stock price. When the ships carrying the East India Company tea arrived in Boston Harbor, the furious American colonists, enraged by this blatant corporate monopoly and taxation without representation, boarded the ships and threw the tea into the ocean. The Boston Tea Party, the inciting incident of the American Revolution, was not just a protest against the British king. It was a direct, violent protest against a corporate bailout and the monopolistic power of the East India Company. The unyielding greed of this corporation literally caused the United States of America to declare independence. But the loss of the American market barely slowed the corporate leviathan. In the 19th century, the East India Company orchestrated perhaps its most mathematically evil operation, the creation of a global narco-empire. The company was deeply dependent on buying tea, silk, and porcelain from China to sell in Europe. But the Chinese emperor had absolutely no interest in buying British-manufactured goods. He demanded that all Chinese exports be paid for in solid silver. This created a massive trade deficit that was draining the East India Company's silver reserves. The corporate executives needed a product that they could mass-produce cheaply in India and that the Chinese population would be forced to buy, regardless of what their emperor decreed. They chose opium. The East India Company forced hundreds of thousands of Indian farmers in Bengal to rip up their food crops and plant massive fields of poppies. The company built massive, industrialized drug factories in Patna, where the raw opium was processed into highly addictive smoking paste, packed into wooden chests, and stamped with the East India Company logo. Because selling opium in China was strictly illegal and carried the death penalty, the company couldn't sell it directly. Instead, they utilized a network of independent country ships, essentially corporate-sponsored drug smugglers, to transport the opium from Calcutta to the coast of China, where it was sold to corrupt local syndicates. The operation was a spectacular, horrifying success. The East India Company flooded the Chinese coast with thousands of tons of high-grade opium. Within a decade, millions of Chinese citizens, from government officials to dock workers, became hopelessly addicted. The social fabric of southern China began to completely unravel.
The flow of silver reversed. The Chinese addicts were draining their nation's silver reserves to pay the British smugglers for the drug. When the desperate Chinese emperor finally sent a notoriously incorruptible official, Lin Zexu, to Guangzhou in 1839 to confiscate and destroy the British opium, the East India Company and the British government retaliated with absolute, devastating military force. The British sent their advanced naval warships, heavily armed with cannons and rockets, to obliterate the outdated Chinese war junks. This was the First Opium War.
It was, quite literally, a war fought by the world's most powerful military to defend the right of a private corporation to operate a massive, illegal, international drug cartel. The British won the war, forced the Chinese government to pay for the destroyed opium, forced them to open their ports to unlimited British drug smuggling, and seized the island of Hong Kong as a permanent base of operations for their corporate drug lords. The East India Company had proven that they would destroy the health and sovereignty of an entire empire just to balance a spreadsheet. When we analyze the moral complexity of the East India Company, we are forced to confront the terrifying reality of the corporate form when it is stripped of all regulatory and moral boundaries. The East India Company was not a nation-state. It did not have a constitution. It had no theoretical obligation to the welfare, the education, or the human rights of the millions of people it ruled. Its only foundational document was a royal charter, and its only legal mandate was the maximization of shareholder profit. The blurring of the lines between the state and the corporation was absolute.
The company possessed a flag, a military, a highly complex justice system, and territory that spanned a subcontinent, but it answered to absolutely no one except a small, insulated group of investors in London, who never had to look into the eyes of the people they were starving to death. The executives in London could simply view the death of 10 million Bengalis not as a holocaust, but merely as an unfortunate supply chain disruption that required an adjustment in the tax rate to offset the loss of revenue.
Enceladus.
It is the ultimate manifestation of the psychopathy inherent in the corporate structure, the abstraction of horrific human suffering into sterilized data points on a financial ledger. The philosophical conclusion to the saga of the East India Company is a violent, inevitable implosion. You cannot run a continent of 200 million people as an extraction facility indefinitely. The pressure cooker finally exploded in 1857 in what is known as the Indian Mutiny or the First War of Indian Independence. The company's own private army, the sepoys, finally pushed beyond the breaking point by the relentless arrogance, racism, and religious insensitivity of their corporate masters, turned their rifles on the British officers. The rebellion was massive, brutal, and incredibly bloody on both sides. The East India Company, despite its vast power, was unable to crush the uprising on its own. They had to beg the official British military to intervene and save them. The British Crown sent massive reinforcements and violently suppressed the rebellion, but the political reality in London had shifted. The sheer incompetence, the endless corruption, and the staggering loss of life finally proved too much even for the deeply compromised British Parliament. In 1858, the British government passed the Government of India Act. They officially nationalized the East India Company. They stripped the corporation of all its administrative powers, its private army, and its territories, transferring total control directly to the British Crown, establishing the era of the British Raj. The world's most powerful mega-corporation was unceremoniously liquidated, reduced to a mere historical footnote, a shell company that existed solely to manage the payout of its remaining dividends until it was finally dissolved entirely in 1874. But the warning of the East India Company remains permanently etched into the architecture of modern capitalism. It stands as the ultimate, terrifying cautionary tale of unregulated monopoly power. When a corporation becomes so large that it can dictate terms to sovereign nations, when it can capture the legislative process through lobbying and bribery, and when its only legal obligation is the relentless mechanical pursuit of profit, the result is always human devastation on an industrial scale. The East India Company proved that the corporate structure, if left unchecked, will naturally evolve into a predatory state, willing to starve millions, engineer drug epidemics, and wage wars just to ensure the stock price ticks upward by a fraction of a percent.
The era of the East India Company may be over, but the psychological DNA of the megacorporation, the abstraction of humanity into mere data points on a balance sheet, remains the driving force of the global economy today. If this deep dive into the true history of the British East India Company, the invention of the corporate bailout, and the horrific reality of narco-capitalism changed the way you view the history of the British Empire and the nature of modern corporations, please subscribe and leave a comment below with your thoughts. I read every single one of them.
Enceladus. Suggest which historical event, economic crisis, or hidden psychological operation we should investigate in the next video, and I'll see you there.